Спасибо. Good day. We start our lecture. Our topic for today is the Russian Empire in the 18th century. We should explore several questions for today. First of all, Russia at the beginning of the 19th century at Alexander I, Russian Emperor, movement of Decembrists, Nicholas I and his time, cancellation of the serfdom and its consequence, bourgeois reforms of the 60th, 70th of the 19th century, movement of populists, Alexander III's counter-reforms. So a lot of questions should be discussed for today. Literature for this topic is the Cambridge History of Russia, Volume 2, and Michael Kort, A Brief History of Russia, should be useful. So, let's discuss first Russian Emperor of the 19th century, Alexander I. At 1:30 a.m. on March 12th of 1801, the Count Palin reported to Alexander about murder of his father. Already in the manifesto of March 12th of 1801, the new emperor assumed liability to operate the people under laws and on the heart of the wise grandma. As well as in private conversations, the emperor expressed the basic rule by which he will be guided in degrees to the place of the personal arbitrariness it is active to install strict legality. Within a month, Alexander returned on service of all earlier dismissed by Paul, removed prohibition on import of various goods and products to Russia, including books and music notes, announced amnesty to fugitives, restored noble elections. On April the 2nd, he restored action of the appointed diploma to the nobility in the cities, liquidated secret office. In the field of foreign policy, on the 5th of June of 17, according to style of 1801, in St. Petersburg, the Russian-English Convention, which finished interstate crisis, was signed, and on May 10, the Russian mission in Vienna is restored. On September 29 and October 8 of 1801, the peace treaty was signed with France. On September 29, the confidential convention is signed. What does it mean, secret committee? The secret committee consisted of several persons extremely close to Russian Emperor Kochubey, Novosibtsev, Stroganov and Czartoryski. The secret committee, functioning till November 9 of 1803, in 2.5 years, considered questions of implementation of senatorial and ministerial reform, activity of indispensable council, a country question, coronation project of 1801, and a number of foreign policy actions. What was the primary task of this committee? It was to help the emperor with systematic work on the reform of the shapeless building of management of the empire. So, we should conclude that the secret committee was very useful for young Russian emperor. But an attitude towards the secret committee from the side of Russian noblemen was different. For example, Derzhavin called members of secret committee by Jacobin gang. Admiral Shishkov, young confidant of Alexander, composed variety, had neither experience nor knowledge, began to blame, called former resolutions, laws and ceremonies obsolete, ignorant. The first reform provided by Alexander I was the Senate reform. Young friends considered necessary to reform a control system of the state. Reform of the Senate became the first. Platon Zubov suggested to grant to the Senate the legislative rights, having made it of the nobility and dignitaries. Derzhavin offered that the Senate the high-ranking official chose. Both offers are rejected. And according to the will of Alexander, the Senate is announced by the supreme judicial and control body, storage of laws. And decrees of the Senate should be executed as own decrees of the sovereign. The second one was ministerial reform. On September the 8th of 1802, manifesto about establishment of the ministries was issued. Unlike boards, the ministry were under construction of the principle of one-man management. Several ministries were introduced in Russia during the time of rule of Alexander I. For example, Foreign Affairs Ministry, Military, Internal Affairs Ministry, Commerce Ministry, Finance Ministry, Justice Ministry, National Education and Naval Ministry. A typical structure of ministry was as the following. Ministry was divided onto departments, departments were divided onto tables, and each minister had minister's companion or a deputy of ministry. Minister's companion could be understood as a deputy of minister. And one of the most significant for Alexander I government was country question. In 1801, on an initiative of Mordvinov, the decree about so-called free plowmen was issued. According to this decree, landowners acquired the right to liberate peasants, providing them with the land in property for repayment. Free plowmen acquired the right to own and dispose of the land without shattering it into sites less than 8 titus. The repayment made 100 rubles silver coins or 4 banknotes, 400 rubles with banknotes for each soul of peasant. The next one was reform of national education. In 1803, the four-stage education system was created. Educational system consisted of 4 levels, and the highest level of Russian education was universities level. The lowest level was parish school. 4 universities were opened in Russia during the beginning of 19th century, and the 5th one was the St. Petersburg Teachers Training College. In 1819 it is transformed to the university. According to the University Chapter of 1804, the universities used considerable autonomy, independently elected the rector, deans of faculties, professors. At the universities there were own court, the authorities did not interfere with their internal affairs. And here is a picture illustrated to you the university yard of the Vilnius University. By the way, medical faculty was present in each university of Russian Empire during the 19th century. The next thing you should know, it is the role of Mikhail Mikhailovich Speransky in a process of transformation of Russian Empire. At the end of the 1808, Alexander I charged to Speransky development of the plan of the state transformation of Russia. In October of 1809, the project under the name Introduction to the Code of the State Laws was presented to the Emperor. Planned task was to modernize and Europeanize public administration by introduction of bourgeois norms and forms. And according to the project of Speransky, estates were presented as the following. The nobility has the civil and political rights. The average state has the civil rights, the right for movable and immovable property, freedom of occupations and movements to appear on its own behalf in court, merchants, petty bourgeoisies, the state peasants. The working people have the general civil rights, civil liberty on personality, landowner, peasants, workers, and house servants. Program of transformations presented by Mikhail Mikhailovich Speransky had a very poor destiny, because at the Emperor the State Council is created. However, the Emperor keeps all completeness of the power. And the Emperor could interrupt the sessions of the State Duma and even to dismiss having appointed new elections. The State Duma was considered as a representative body at the Emperor. Ministers are appointed the Emperor. And the project met persistent counteraction of senators, ministers, and other highest dignitaries, and Alexander I did not decide to realize it. However, the State Council, according to the plan of Speransky, was founded on January 1 of 1810. Foreign policy of the period of government of Alexander I was very difficult. In 1805, by the conclusion of a number of treaties, the new anti-French coalition was actually issued, and on September 9 the same year Alexander left for field army. Though the commander was Mikhail Kutuzov, Alexander began to play actually a major role in decision-making process. The emperor bears the main responsibility for the defeat of the Russian-Austrian army at Austerlitz. Nevertheless, serious measures were taken in respect of a number of generals. The Lieutenant General Langeron was dismissed from service. The Lieutenant General Przybrzewski and the Major General Lushakov are prosecuted. The Novgorod Musketeer Regiment was deprived of differences. On November 26 of 1805, a truce on which the Russian troops had to leave the Austrian territory was called. 8 of June of 1806 in Paris, the Russian-French peace treaties was signed. In September of 1806, Prussia began war against France, and on November 16 of 1806, Alexander announced a performance in the Russian Empire against France. On June of 25, on July of 7, according to a new style of calendar of 1807, made the Tilsit Peace Treaty, under the terms of which recognized territorial changes in Europe with France, undertook to call a truce with Turkey and to disengage troops from Moldova and Wallachia, to join continental blockade, a rupture of trade relations with England, to provide to Napoleon troops for the war in Europe, and also to mediate between France and Great Britain. And now let's go to exploration to the most significant event of the beginning of the 19th century, I mean Patriotic War of 1812. What were war reasons? The Emperor Napoleon I demanded from the Emperor Alexander I to forfeit blockade of England. And the Russian Empire did not observe continental blockade and imposed on the French goods tax. Russia demanded to disengage the French troops from Prussia, placed there in defiance of their Tilsit contract. On the night of June 12 of 1812, troops numbering 608,000 people of Napoleon intruded in borders of Russia. They were headed by the Emperor and his glorified commanders, who subdued the whole Europe. The Russian army consisted only of 210,000 soldiers and officers. Besides, it was divided into 3 parts and dispersed along the western border. What were the plans of France? The primary idea of Napoleon was not to allow connection of the Russian armies and to break their main forces already near border, to take Moscow, having brought Russia out of war, to turn it into the dependent state, through the territory of Russia to strike blow to England, having deprived of it India. I remind you that during this period of time, at the beginning of 19th century, India was the most significant colony of Great Britain, and Napoleon Bonaparte tried to capture India. What was the plan of Russia? It was supposed that Napoleon will attack St. Petersburg, and therefore a decisive battle was planned to be given near border by forces of the First Army with assistance of Bagration's army. However, plans of the Russian General Staff did not manage to be implemented. In the conditions of the fast advance of the enemy, the right image of actions was chosen only, at any cost to keep troops and without entering decisive battle to connect forces of the First and the Second Armies. With huge work it was succeeded to carry out connection of troops, but failures of the first weeks of war generated deep despondency in society. On this background, calls to appointment as the commander-in-chief of the Russian army on the latest Prince Mikhail Ilarionovich Kutuzov. Here is a portrait of him presented at this slide. They are even more often made. At 5:30 a.m. in the morning on August of 26 of 1812, more than 100 French troops began shelling opposition on the left flank. The village was defended by a Guards Yegorsky regiment under command of a Colonel Bistron. About half an hour of the Huntsman bit off, quadruple surpassing opponent. However, under the threat of the round from the flank were forced to recede for the river. After them also the 106th Linear Regiment of the French was transported. The commander of the 1st Western Army, Barclay de Tolly, directed to the help of the 1st, 19th and 14th Yegersky of the Shelf Regiment, which counterattacked the French troops, dumped them, and burned the bridge through the river. As a result of this fight, the French 106th Regiment suffered heavy losses. Having entered army command in August, Kutuzov declared that actions of his predecessor were quite true and receded ever closer to Moscow. Only in 110 kilometers from the ancient Russian capital, near the village of Borodino, he decided to give decisive battle to Napoleon. Forces of the parties were approximately equal. France 135,000 people and 587 Jews, Russia 132 Jews on 1,000 people. Russia had troops as 132,000 troops and 640 Jews and cannons. The Borodino battle continued for 12 hours. The glorified French commander did not solve in him any of objectives. Covering the battlefield with thousands of corpses, he took the main strong points of the Russian position, Semenovsky High, Bagration Flesh, and High of Kurgany, Rayevsky Battery, but could not develop success. The history of all its battles did not know similar examples. Borodino battle was one of the most bloody battles of the 19th century and the most bloody of all which were to it. By the most modest estimates of cumulative losses, each hour 2,500 people in the field perished. Some divisions lost up to 80% of the structure. It was a terrible losses indeed. The Russian army was located on the bank of Nara River in the ancient Russian village of Tarutino after the end of Borodino battle. It allowed covering ways or withdrawal of French on the south to give armies rest. In the Tarutinsky camp constantly there arrived reinforcements. Several attempts of the French to pass the areas which are not ruined by war were beaten successfully off. Together with the Russian army, the city was left by its many inhabitants, Moscow. By order of the Governor-General Rostopchin, Moscow was set on fire. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte had been waiting for the deputation of boyars with the key of Moscow. Napoleon having been located in Poklon mountain admired by Russian capital, but contrary to expectations of him, the deputation of the Moscow boyars with keys from the city did not appear. The huge loss was caused to the French by guerrilla troops which blocked communications with the French from Moscow to border in the west. The Colonel Davidov, who received on this consent of Mikhail Kutuzov even before Borodino battle, became the initiator of the guerrilla movement. Soon, in the territories occupied by the enemy groups from among locals began to arise. Napoleon, who was in Moscow, very quickly understood that it appeared in a trap. Having achieved the long-awaited objectives, he could not sign the peace treaty. The army in the ice turned into marauders. The winter in the ruined and burned city ahead was coming. The General Laurie Stone, you can see him at this slide, sent with the offer on the peace negotiations on first to Kutuzov and then to Alexander I, came back with nothing. And after the last battle, and the last battle was played at a crossing through the river Berezina in November of 1812, Russian straight-off attacked the French, and Napoleon, who lost near the 30,000 more soldiers through army and through remains of old guard, came back to Paris. On December of 25, Alexander I published the Manifesto on exile of an enemy from Russia and the termination of patriotic war. On October the 6th, Napoleon gave the order to retreat from Moscow, leaving the French mine the Kremlin, St. Basil's Cathedral, etc., but the Russian patriots could neutralize charges. The emperor expected to break on Kalushka Road on the south in a way to keep his army alive there and the next year to resume fighting. But it was impossible to do. Here is a very interesting portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte in winter clothes in Russia, because he suffered greatly from Russian freezes, cruel Russian freezes. And here is a picture of road of Napoleon troops from Moscow. What was the last period of rule of Alexander I? Alexander claimed that the poor 3,000 peasants were distributed as a bag of diamonds. And the civilization was more developed. I would stop the serfdom even if it would cost me the head. Resolving an issue of universal corruption, it was left without people faithful to it, and filling of the government position by Germans and other foreigners only led to a bigger resistance to its reforms from all Russians. So Alexander's government began with a great opportunity to improvement came to an unwaning of chains of neck of Russian people. It happens to a lesser extent because of corruption and conservatism of the Russian life, and in bigger because of personal qualities of the Tsar. His love to freedom, despite her geniality, was not based on reality. It flattered itself being presented to the world as a very kind ruler, but his theoretical liberalism was connected with aristocratic willfulness, peremptory. Moreover, his patronizing temperament was combined with usage of weak characters to grab any opportunity to postpone use of the principles which is publicly maintained. At Alexander I, the Freemasonry became almost state organization. However, it was forbidden by special imperial decree in 1822. At the time, the biggest Masonic lodge of the Russian Empire, Pontus the Evkshinsky, was in Odessa, which the emperor visited in 1820. The sovereign, before the hobby for orthodoxy, patronized Masons, and on the views was a big Republican and radical liberals of Western Europe. During the last rule, Alexander I, special influence in the country was got by Arakcheyev, establishment of the military settlements since 1815, and also defeat of professorial personnel of many universities became manifestation of conservatism in Alexander policy. In August 16 of 1823, Alexander published the confidential manifesto in which he accepted reunification of the brave Constantine of his succession to the throne and appointed the younger brother Nicholas Pavlovich the legitimate heir. Death. What should be said about death of Alexander I? The Emperor Alexander, on November of 1825, in Taganrog, in Popkov's house, died of a fever with inflammation of the brain at the age of 47 years. Alexander Pushkin wrote an epitaph: "Carry Tao all life on the way, caught a cold and died in Taganrog." The sudden death of the emperor generated the mass of rumors of the people. For example, in Schilder's biography of the emperor gives 31 opinions which arose within several weeks after Alexander's death. One of the rumors reported that the sovereign ran under concealment to Kiev and will live about Greece with Haak there and will begin to give an advice necessary to the present sovereign Nikolai Pavlovich for the best government. Other version is stated in the book of column of Artemy Cherep-Spiridovich, the hidden hand. After lunch in the Jewish synagogue, it returned to Taganrog and felt not very well. Now he knew about existence of a secret plot directed on his murder. The Tsar called the doctor Sir James Willis. "Oh, my friend, that for monsters, that for ungrateful villains, and I so truly wish them well-being." The Tsar was poisoned with the well-known aqua tofana, however, was officially declared that he got sick and typhus fever because of fair mass rites of Jews. Poison worked slowly, inflicting on Alexander inexpressible suffering. At some point it seems that the sovereign can be saved. The people, having received this news, began to dance from delight. On December 1st of 1825, the Tsar opened eyes and, being not able to speak, kissed the Empress's hand. Several minutes later he expired. From effect of poison his face blackened. Later, in 30-40 years of the 19th century, there was a legend that Alexander, exhausted with remorse, allegedly as the accomplice of the murder of the father, dramatized the death in the distance from the capital and the beginning's vagabond, hermetical life under a name of the aged man Fyodor Kuzmich, died on February 12 of 1864 in Tomsk. Let's have a look at Fyodor Kuzmich. A lot of scientists, historians in Russia respect now that Fyodor Kuzmich is very similar, his portrait is very similar to Alexander I, and he looks like Alexander I probably. The next Russian emperor after the death of Alexander I was Nicholas I Pavlovich, the emperor all-Russian from 1825 to 1855, the third son of the Emperor Paul I and the Empress Maria Feodorovna. Here is a portrait of him. What were achievements of Nicholas Pavlovich rule, of Nicholas I? At Nicholas I, military and sea academies were founded, 11 military schools, the first railroad from the capital to Tsarskoye Selo are open, and it's later to Moscow. So, railway roads appeared in Russia initially during the time of rule of Nicholas I. Nicholas I's government began with the suppression of a Decembrist uprising, Decembrist revolt, which was planned for December 14 of 1825, day when Russia had to swear to Nicholas. We can remember now several Decembrist organizations, secret organizations, but the most powerful and the most influential of them were two organizations, the Southern Society and so-called Northern Society. Revolts were organized with Northern and Southern societies. Revolt at Synod Square on December 14 of 1825, Northern Society was depressed government troops. During suppression of this revolt, about 1,270 people were killed. Revolt of the Chernigiv Regiment on December 29 of 1825, on January 3 of 1826, also was crushed by government troops. And Decembrists were punished to death. Execution of Decembrists. Ryleev, Pestel, Muravyev-Apostol, Bestuzhev-Ryumin and Kakhovsky were executed through hanging. 88 people were condemned on a hard labor. The others, about 500 people, were banished to Siberia, to the Caucasus, degraded in soldiers. Some were put in fortress according to the personal will of Nicholas I. And here is a view of suppression of revolt at Synod Square in St. Petersburg, with a lot of victims. After suppression of Decembrist revolt, a system of Russian public administration was reformed, and the highest body of imperial power became own office of its Imperial Majesty. The first office, the first department of this office, was officeries of office, control over the ministries, prepared bills, new appointment and dismissal of the high-ranking officials from approval, and the statement on the Tsar. The second department of office was conducted for systematization of the legislation. The third department of office was engaged in investigation of political cases, carried out censorship, fought against all beliefs and sectarianism, investigated cases of ill treatment of landowners with peasants. The fourth department, new charitable institutions and women's educational institutions. The fifth office prepared the project of reform of state peasants, and the sixth office prepared the project of reform of management of the Caucasus. Codification of Russian laws. A special department of Imperial Office, the second department, was involved into the codification of laws. Complete collection of laws of the Russian Empire initially was introduced in 1830. It was the fullest collection of the acts arranged chronologically by numbers of the adoption of each act with Tsar. The Code of Laws of the Russian Empire, an official collection of existing acts of the Russian Empire, located in a thematic order. It was for the first time printed during 1832. And what should be said about the third office? The third office was a very influential and powerful organization in the system of state body administration. The third office. Here is a portrait of the head of the third office, Graf Count Benkendorf. At the head of the third office there was a Count Benkendorf. Nicholas' censorship was connected with the adoption in 1826 with the pig iron censorship statute. It was forbidden to print practically everything that had any political background. The University Decree of 1833 practically liquidated autonomy of the universities and established strict supervision of students. Nicholas in every possible way suppressed the slightest manifestations of free thinking. Many advanced people of Russia suffered persecution and repressions. According to Nicholas I order, the magazines European, Moscow Telegraph, Telescope were closed. Also military operations took place also in the Caucasus. It was so-called Caucasian War from 1819 up to 1864, which the Russian Empire tried to annex to itself. Those years, wide circulation got the Muridism referral, national liberation movements of the mountaineers of the now Caucasus, which completely sputtered out by 1864. And here is a portrait of Imam Shamil, who was a leader of Muridism movement. More tolerant policy of imperial authorities in the Caucasus surrender of the Imam Shamil in 1859, and suppression of resistance of mountaineers became a result of military operations. During time of rule of Nicholas I, the country question was an important part of domestic policy of the state. He tried to resolve peasants' problem, the problem of serfs. A large number of peasants' uprisings took place at the first half of the 19th century, and in the period of 1830-1831 there were cholera revolts, counteractions of city dwellers, peasants and soldiers, and the measure taken by the state for fight against cholera epidemic. In 3440 there were potato revolts. Very funny, potato revolts were caused by violent introduction of landing of potatoes, which were suppressed by governmental troops. The Ministry of State, Possession and local bodies, Paul Kiselov, to which guardianship over state peasants for a rural community was assigned, is founded. The state peasants received self-government as a result of his reform and an opportunity to solve the cases within the rural community. Monetary reform of Cancrin, Yegor Frantsevich. Monetary reform was connected with introduction of silver coin, of silver ruble. In 1825, the external debt of Russia reached 102 million rubles silver. The country was flooded with the paper banknotes which were issued by the government trying to cover military expenses and payments of the external debt. Cancrin was appointed to a post of Ministry of Finance. Cancrin sought to limit the public expenditures, carefully possessed the credit, and adhered to the system of protectionism, imposing high taxes on the goods imported into Russia. And let's go to foreign policy. Russian-Iranian War of 1826-1828. Intentions of Iran to return themselves the lands lost under the Gulistansky contract became the reason for war. Having a superiority in strength, Persians lost war, having signed the Turkmenchaisky peace treaty. Only to Russia passed Erivansky and the Hichevan Khanates. At the same time, the government of Persia undertook not to interfere with resettlement of Armenians to Russia. Contribution in 20 million rubles by silver was imposed on Persia. The exclusive right of Russia was confirmed to keep the military fleet on the Caspian Sea. Russian-Turkish War of 1828-1829. The revolt of Greeks against Turkey in 1821 was a war caused. Greece was helped then by France, Russia and England. As a result of military operations, when the capital of the Ottoman Empire appeared it is in danger, the Bosphorus Straits and Dardanelles were blocked by the Russian fleet. The government of Turkey, headed by the Sultan Mahmud II, requested the peace negotiations. On September 2nd of 1829, the Adrianople Peace Treaty was signed. According to the contract, Russia returned to Turkey all territories in the European part occupied during war, except for the mouth of Danube with islands. To Russia passed all east coast of the Black Sea, from the mouth of Kuban River to St. Nicholas Pure, with fortresses Anapa, Sujuk Kala and Porti, and city Ahalkashi and Ahalkalaki. Turkey recognized transition to Russia of Georgia, Emirate, Mingrelia, Guria, and also the Erivansky and the Hichevan Khanates. According to Inkaris-Kilisivsky peace contract, friendship and defensive alliance between Russia and Turkey was formed. It is signed on June 26 of 1833 in the town Üsküdar Kilissi near Istanbul after Russia gave military support to the Sultan in fight against his rebellious vassal Muhammad Ali Egypt. The contract provided the military alliance between two countries in case one of them was attacked. The confidential additional article of the contract allowed Turkey not to send troops but demanded closing of Bosphorus for the ships of any countries except Russia. The contract was signed for a period of 8 years. Crimean War. Crimean War of 1853-1856. Napoleon III's conflict with Nicholas I became a prelude to war. When Napoleon III came to the power, Nicholas I, in the congratulatory telegram, instead of the word brother, wrote "my friend." It was recognized as official insult of the French emperor. Fight for keys from church, the temple of the Lord's coffin in Jerusalem, which were given to France, became a direct occasion of war. From water battles in Sinope Bay in 1853, it allocated. Our squadron, Russian squadron, under command of General Nakhimov, crushed the Turkish fleet as soon as France and England were reached by messages about the Sinope battle. They at once put forward the squadrons of the Black Sea on December 23 of 1853. And on March 15 of 1854, Great Britain and France declared war of Russia. Here is a portrait of the hero of Crimean War, Pavel Stepanovich Nakhimov, glorious Russian admiral. Nakhimov was very talented and he was a head of the Sebastopol defense during the campaign of Crimean War. Another famous hero of the Crimean War was Vladimir Alexeyevich Kornilov. Kornilov was a chief of staff of Black Sea Fleet and since 1851 actually ordered the fleet. On the eve of the Crimean War, he organized fast transfer by the Sea Infantry divisions to the Caucasus, which played a crucial role in the reflection of the Turkish approach. In September of 1854, the Chief of Defense of north side of Sebastopol, and after Battle of the Alma River, being the Chief of Staff of Garrison of Sebastopol. Istomin, Vladimir Ivanovich Istomin, was another hero of the Crimean War. During the Russian-Turkish War of 1827-1829, he served in Kronstadt under Lazarev's team. He was involved in Navarin battle, for which received St. George Award, and in blockade of Dardanelles he participated. Peter Markovich Koshka, sailor of Black Sea Fleet. He was a hero of Sevastopolskaya defense. He was participant of Sinope battle. He was one of the most famous heroes of defense of Sebastopol. In days of defense of Sebastopol, among other sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, he was sent to the coast. Defeat encourages initiative actions, bravery, and resourcefulness in fight, especially in investigation and when taking prisoners. He was very brave. He was brave enough to be involved into cruel battles. Dasha Sebastopolskaya, remember this name please, Dasha Sebastopolskaya. The real surname of her was Daria Mikhailova. Dasha Sebastopolskaya was the nurse, the heroine of defense of Sebastopol during time of Crimean War. During defense of Sebastopol, Daria Mikhailova, as well as the other Sebastopol nurses, under fire of the opponent, provided to wounded defenders of Sebastopol medical care. pulled out them from fire in infirmary. Without knowing its surname, I called it Dasha Sebastopolskaya. However, she not only provided medical care, but also, having changed clothes in men's wear, was involved in fights and went on reconnaissance. For special merits, she only in the lowest estate was ordered with a gold medal on the Vladimir film for diligence. And she is recognized as the founder of nurses movement. She was the first nurse all over the world history. The Crimean War was ended by a siege of Sebastopol. Many defenders of the city were seamen. Engineers of defense was the General Totleven, the military engineer. Having worried winter, for which they were badly trained, allies rushed to the sea attack and entered the Sea of Azov to the east from Crimea. What were the results of the Crimean War? Through new social and economic processes also undermined a feudal system, but it continued to remain dominating up to 1861. Here the considerable role was played by autocracy. His politician was contradictory. On the one hand, it contributed to the economic development of the country up to support of capitalist business, with another sought to preserve social structure of society, guarded feudal orders. So, after the defeat of Russia in Crimean War, and during the Crimean War, Nicholas I died, and a successor of him became Alexander II Nikolaevich under nickname Liberator. He was an emperor of all Russian, the Tsar of the Polish, and Grand Duke of Finnish of Romanov dynasty. He became in Russian history as the conductor of large-scale reforms, Liberator. He was rather clever, he was rather experienced, and he got an excellent education. Alexander II ended Crimean War with signing of Parisian peace contract. What were main conditions of Parisian peace contract? Russia returned to Ottomans the city of Kars with the fortress, receiving Sebastopol, captured Balaclava and other Crimean cities in exchange. The Black Sea appeared neutral, but is open for commercial and closed for naval ships. Swimming across Danube appeared free, for what Russian borders were removed from the river, and a part of Russian Bessarabia with the mouth of Danube was attached to Moldova. And the most significant reform of Alexander II was cancellation of serfdom. Just remember, cancellation of serfdom. What should be said about cancellation of serfdom? It took place in 1861 in St. Petersburg. Alexander II signed the Manifest on Cancellation of Serfdom. Landowners kept property on all lands belonging to them, however were obliged to provide in use to peasants' estates, settled life, and a field plot. Peasants were granted the right of repayment on the estate, and under the agreement with the landowner, a field plot. Here is a view of the manifesto about liberation of Russian peasants. It was really great reform. Transition of peasants for repayment dragged on for several decades. to 1881 remained in the temporarily dependent position of relations of 15% of peasants, but in a number of their provinces was allowed. The landowners who had big debts more often than others sought to accelerate repayments and to conclude voluntary bargains. What were the results of serf reform? Peasant reform of 1861 laid the foundation for process of fast impoverishment of peasants. The average country plot in Russia during the period of these years decreased from 4.8 to 3.5 types, almost by 30%. The next reform conducted by the government of Alexander II was territorial reform. Reform consisted on January the 1st of 1864 that questions of local economy, collecting taxes, the approval of the budget, primary education, medical and veterinary care, from now on were charged to electoral institution, district or provisional territorial district justices. Election of representatives from the population in Zemstvo, a special body of power. Zemstvo, territorial vowels, were to sedate and provided numerical prevalence of noblemen. The next reform was city reform. City reform of 1870 was reform replaced the existing earlier class city management of the city councils elected on the basis of property qualification. City reform was very useful for local administration. Here is the results of city reform in Feodosia, one of the Crimean cities of that time. Here is a view of Simferopol source of water as a result of city reform. The next reform was judicial reform. The new judicial chapter was adopted in 1864. The chapter introduced the uniform system of legal agencies, proceeding from formal equality of all social groups before the law. Court sessions were held with participation of interested parties, were public, and reports on them were published in the press. Military reform was the next, and the main idea of military reform was modernization of army and introduction of a general compulsory military service in 1874 instead of recruitment and reduction of service life. Indeed, military reform was very useful according to its consequences view. To military service, the male population on reaching 21 years was attracted. The persons exempted from military service on various privileges over 1/2 of recruits were enlisted in militia on a case of declaration of war. And here is a very interesting illustration of military reform. On the left side of this illustration you can see an old recruit coming back to his home with a total absence of family and children. And on the right side of this picture you can see a soldier turning back from his military service and his meeting with wife and children. Educational reform. Classical and real gymnasiums were intended for children of noblemen and merchants. Gymnasiums were divided onto pro-gymnasium, classical gymnasium and real gymnasium. What is the difference between classical gymnasium and real gymnasium? In classical gymnasium, in program, ancient and foreign languages prevailed, and in the problem of real gymnasiums, mathematics prevailed, physics prevailed, and other technical objects prevailed. A great changes took place in the field of national education. A new university chapter was adopted in 1863. A school chapter was adopted in 1864. And one of the most interesting things, an introduction of reform of field of national education, was female education. At 60-70 years in Russia, female higher education appeared. And you can see at this picture a typical view of girl student. In 1869, the higher female courses were opened. The greatest popularity was gained by the courses opened in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. And here is a picture illustrated for you a visit of Russian emperor to one of the village schools. Reform of autocracy. At the end of Alexander II reign, the project of creation of two bodies at the Tsar, expansion of already existing state council, including generally large grandees and officials, and creation of a general commission with possible participation of representatives from zemstvos, but which was generally formed to destination. The government was made. So, Alexander II planned to reform autocracy, but he has not done it yet by the end of his rule. The main directions of the foreign policy of Russia during the time of Alexander II. European policy included the relationships with Austria, Prussia, and with France. After the reunification of Germany in 1871, on the western border of Russia there was a powerful aspiring in leadership power. In the union with Austria, Germany posed the threat of Russia. The Russian diplomacy went for conclusion of agreement with potential opponents. The union of three emperors is created. Completion of the Caucasian War. At the end of 50th, at the beginning of 60th, significant forces were directed to fight against Mountaineers. And on the May of 21 of 1646, the last 1864, the last center of resistance of Circassian tribes is suppressed. It is the expiration date of the Caucasian War. Policy of Russia in Central Asia. During the time of rule of Alexander I, Russian troops entered to Central Asia, and Central Asia became the province of Russian Empire. What were the consequences of accession to Central Asia and annexation of Central Asia? The Russian administration pursued the policy in the attached territories taking into account local traditions without taking away the power from local lords and clergy, and at the same time improving position of peasants. Slavery and slave trade were liquidated. Far East policy. At the 19th century, Russia had no officially recognized borders with the neighbors such as Japan and China. In May of 1858, the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia, Muravyov, proposed to establish relationships with China. And according to Alaska, the first Russian settlements on Alaska was founded in 1784 by the traveler and businessman Gregory Shelikhov. Since then, Alaska carried the name of Russian America. Alaska was operated by the Russian-American Company. Half-century, she equipped settlements for distribution of Christianity and civilization there. Such expenses could pay off only in the future, but this future for Russian America did not come. Sale of Alaska, the transaction between the governments of the Russian Empire and the North American United States, as a result of which, remember this date, in 1867, Russia for $7.2 million sold its possession in North America. For the first time, the initiative of sale of Alaska was taken by the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia Muravyov-Amurski, specifying the need, according to him, is inevitable. Economic development of country during of time of rule of Alexander II was very contradictory, and it was accompanied with a growth of public discontent. During the time of rule of Alexander II, several times, to be clear, 7 times, attempts of assassinations of him were prepared. A first attempt to kill Russian emperor was unsuccessful, the second one in similar way. The third, 5 bullets of the teacher Solovyov, was unsuccessful. The Executive Committee of National Will, a Russian terroristic organization, made on August of 1879 the decision of Alexander II's murder. Here is a portrait of leaders of National Will. The fourth attempt to kill Russian emperor took place in November of 1879. There was an attempt of explosion of imperial train near Moscow. Unsuccessful. The fifth attempt to kill Russian emperor took place in 1880. It was explosion of the first floor of the Winter Palace. Unsuccessful. And the sixth, having recovered from the shock after explosion in the Winter Palace, the authorities began mass arrests, executed several terrorists. Alexander II was warned about new attempts, but the emperor quietly answered that he is under divine protection. On March the 13th of 1881, he went to the carriage on the embankment of the Kerensky Channel in St. Petersburg. And during this day, two explosions sounded and Alexander II was killed. So, Alexander II was killed during explosion of bomb, the second during attempt thrown under his legs by a terrorist Ignatiy Grinevitsky. National Will, a terroristic organization, was crushed. Her heads are executed. Bloody and senseless hunting for the Russian emperor came to the end with death of all its participants. Burial. On the bank of the Kerensky Channel, now Griboyedov's Channel, in that place where Alexander II was mortally wounded, Church of the Resurrection, which received the national name Church of the Savior on Blood, was built. One of the most beautiful temples of the St. Petersburg. What were the main results of Alexander II? Alexander II became history as the reformer and the liberator. In its reign, the serfdom was repealed, the general compulsory military service is entered, zemstvos are founded, judicial reform is undertaken, censorship is limited, some other reforms is carried out. The empire considerably extended due to gain and inclusion to the Central Asian position. So he was very successful but unhappy. His successor was Alexander III, peacekeeper, nicknamed Peacekeeper Alexander III. Let's have a look to several photos illustrating his life and family. Here is a picture of his wife, Danish Princess Dagmar in Orthodoxy Maria Feodorovna. Maria Feodorovna is the mother of the last Russian Emperor Nicholas II. A big family of Russian Emperor. He liked to be engaged in history, collecting of the historical monuments which are especially connected with patriotic memories, and studying of the Russian art all times. Alexander III Alexandrovich was physically vigorous. His growth was 1 meter 90 centimeters. And according to the witness of the Victor's memoirs, it was a type of really autocratic Russian Tsar, and a concept about autocratic Russian Tsar, it is inseparably linked with the concept about the Tsar as patron chief of Russian people. He was devout, devoted in thrift, spent leisure time in the family circle. One of the teachers of the young successor of the throne was Pobedonostsev. Huge influence on Alexander III, his tutor used, chief prosecutor of Synod, Konstantin Pobedonostsev. Pobedonostsev negatively estimated reforms of his father, Alexander II, though itself took part in development of judicial charters. By words of Kony, he recklessly denied all elements of modern cultural life, national representation, court, the press, freedom of speech. Prince Meshchersky, another interesting example of teachers of Alexander III. From Meshchersky's diary, there is something in Russia in the form of indisputable truth understood by the people, this consciousness of need of births. And meanwhile, against this need not only liberals but also conservatives stand up. As a result, dissoluteness, alcoholism, crime are afraid of bitches. Domestic policy of emperor was connected with so-called counter-reforms. The university chapter of 1884 cut off autonomy of the high schools. Territorial and Gorodowy town provisions tightened control after local government. Counter-reforms were measures for protection of the class rights of the nobleman, strengthening of administrative guardianship of the peasantry, preservation of community. Foreign policy of Alexander III was very peaceful and generally went the Tsar and differed in pragmatism, aspiration to save the country from retraction in international conflicts. That's why he was nicknamed as Peacekeeper. In the 80th, 90th years, Russia practically did not wage wars except the conquest of Central Asia, which came to the end with the capture of Kushka. What were the results of Alexander III? It was economic growth. It was a very straight characteristic of economic life of Russia during the rule of Alexander III that was connected with policy of a strengthened industry protection. Revenues of the state treasury increased. And the government encouraged growth of a large industry which achieved noticeable success. The products of metal industry doubled. The network of railroads grew to 47%. Alexander III signed the decree on the beginning of construction of the longest in Russia Trans-Siberian railway line. So he was very interesting Russian emperor. That's all for today. I should tell you about development of Russian Empire in 19th century. Questions? Please send me email with your attendance list. So if you have no questions, goodbye.